Greetings, everybody. A very warm welcome to Kaizen Central. Absolutely delighted to see you here. This overcast where I am, but I hope it's slightly better where you are Thursday evening. As always, it's a delight to have people join us, and particularly Andrew Sentence, our guest for this evening. Andrew, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a great pleasure having a chat with you over the last couple of days, and we're going to hear from you about the challenges faced by the economy, and of course faced by the manufacturing sector. While we wait for people to come online, I'm going to just share the article that Andrew wrote for Cambridge Econometrics. But I don't know if anybody else knows some of Andrew's background, apart from being a member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England. He was a senior advisor at PricewaterhouseCoopers, Cooper, I should say, and also he wrote this song.
My daddy hailed from New Orleans, followed the work of Maynard Keynes.
And so when he stopped playing rock music for Rock in the City, City AM reported it thus. It was a tragedy from which not many rock fans found themselves able to recover. Andrew, is that a fair summation of your rock career? Oh, you're on mute. I'll ask you to, there, you need to unmute. Andrew, you need to unmute.
It's true that I used to play in various rock bands, including that one. But you got the wrong song. The one that I wrote was called The New Normal, which is actually very relevant to what we're doing at the moment.
Okay, all right. Well, I know that when you were on the MPC, am I correct in saying that you would have been regarded as an inflation hawk? Is that a reasonable description to use?
At various times, yeah. I voted for more interest rate cuts than I did for interest rate rises. But you know, that was the nature of where we were in the economic cycle.
And remind me, that was round about the time of the financial crash?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So there were three phases to my time on the MPC. One was 2006-07, when we weren't really expecting anything like the financial market crash or the financial crisis that emerged. So I was then slightly on the hawkish debate, though to be fair, the committee was moving in the same direction, just with a few months lag. And then we were all committed to cutting interest rates when the economy was going badly wrong in the financial crisis. And then I suppose my distinctive contribution was after we started recovering for about a year, saying that we should start gradually raising interest rates. And I think we'll face the same issue actually now after the pandemic crisis. In other words, it's all very easy for monetary policy makers to sit on their hands and say, "Oh, it's all very difficult, blah blah blah." But they're meant to think ahead, and hopefully this time around they'll be a bit bolder in raising interest rates. But I'm not so sure.
Well, let's go back to the inflation. The article you wrote, "Jobs Recovery Brings Inflation Warnings," and just have a look at the latest measures of UK inflation and how it will impact on the manufacturing sector. And that's the average, somewhere around about 4.93. I think that's what that figure there said, 95%. factory gate prices slightly less than that, but there was a figure for the cost of raw materials and other inputs into the manufacturing process are a staggering 10.7% up.
Yeah.
So I guess what we really need to be looking at is what you think the impacts of these inflationary pressures are going to be on the recovery, and whether interest rates having been so low for so long, there's, what the risks are that your former colleagues in the MPC will be weighing up in terms of perhaps throwing the economy back into trouble, and what's the implication if they don't?
Well, first of all, I don't think manufacturers need to worry about small rises in interest rates. I think the most vulnerable businesses are probably paying way above the basic bank rate of 0.1%. I don't think their position will change a great deal. So the main justification for raising interest rates is really focusing on the consumer side of the economy, on the housing market, to try and keep that in order, because on that chart that you put up, the other bar that is going bananas is the rate of house price inflation, which is about 10%. So yes, maybe it's come down a little bit, but it's certainly getting up. That's the second bar, I think, on that on that chart. So, but for manufacturers, I think you're facing higher input price inflation, which is rising energy prices, other commodity prices. They've been going up and down a bit, but most commodity prices, I think I looked at the Economist measure, which they publish in their back pages, which is probably, their average measure for commodity prices about 50-60% or so in sterling terms. And then that's obviously a potential squeeze on profits unless manufacturers can recoup those price rises in the marketplace. Now, you commented that they were slightly below my average, but I think factory gate price inflation is already up to 4.8%, which is showing that manufacturers do need to pass through these price increases in order to recoup the cost increases that they're facing. So, the question is, how do we sort of get out of that? Well, there's no easy way of getting out of it. But to have interest rates at such very, very low levels, at 0.1%, when you've got inflation bubbling up quite strongly, doesn't make sense. And I think there was a time when manufacturers felt that they were at the brunt of when interest rates went up. I think that's less so in the current economy, because manufacturers are very sort of diverse in their activities, most of them, and therefore looking at conditions in many economies. And the justification for a small rise in interest rates, which initially would just be a token rise, would be to give a signal to consumers and the housing market that they need to raise in their activity a bit.
I wonder to what extent is the, I'm sorry, if anybody's got me on speaker, it was getting a bit of feedback. To what extent, Andrew, is that 0.1% in terms of relevance only really relevant to government because that's the rate at which they're borrowing? I mean, real interest rates are above that anyway. You said so yourself. I mean, particularly for those in companies in vulnerable positions, because they'll obviously be paying a lot more than that. But aren't consumers on their credit cards, on their HP, or they're all paying a lot more than that anyway, aren't they?
Well, I think the main gearing to official interest rates is through the housing market, through mortgage rates. But I think you're making a good point. in the sense that the changes in the official interest rate don't necessarily translate very quickly into what actually people are paying in a whole range of sectors of the economy. But it gives a strong signal to the private sector about the Bank of England's willingness to keep monetary conditions in good order. Similarly with quantitative easing, which I think most people find very difficult to understand. But if they rein in quantitative easing a bit, that sends a signal to the private sector, well, hang on, we need to be a bit more cautious about what we're doing in the current environment. Now, the background to all this is that the UK economy is expected to grow by about 7% this year and 5% next year, or 5 to 6% next year. So if that wasn't the case, if we were just expecting to grow by a normal 2 to 3%, I think these arguments would be much less powerful. But we haven't seen 2 years, consecutive years of growth as strong as that in my lifetime, I think. I think the previous strongest year of growth that I can remember was 1973, and that ended in tears in terms of rip-roaring inflation. So I think we need to take seriously the fact that interest rates can't always go down, or they can't always stay at rock bottom levels. They need to be used to sort of keep the economy in check. And if they are used to keep the economy in check in a sensible way, all businesses benefit. It's a stabilizing tool.
It is almost, I mean, you're talking about the 70s, and I was around, of course, and the massive inflation we all experienced, and the political revolution, too strong a word, but the very strong political change of gear that happened in 79, really based on the promise to get inflation down. So 0.1% for interest rates is, I honestly, having lived through 15, 16%, you'll remember those. Quite extraordinary. Andrew, I'd like to introduce you broadly to the group. I'm not going to do it one by one, but we are a diverse group of manufacturers and friends, and friends means consultants, academics, and many. There's some in completely different industries. We have my friend Simon, who's sitting in France at the moment, is in the pharmaceutical analytics business, medical analytics business. But anyway, we all have a very powerful interest in manufacturing and seeing it have a strong and productive future. So chaps, I think it is all chaps tonight. What a shame. I would very much like you to raise your hand, just as Stephen Barr has done just now, if you want to raise a question for Andrew. Stephen, off you go.
I can't resist asking you, Andrew, from your experience, which is very deep and very insightful. Do you think government really cares about manufacturing? I wonder particularly whether you saw any difference between the Labour government and the Conservative one, because you sort of straddle that period in government history.
It's a very interesting question. I think it's probably better put is, does the government understand manufacturing? Because to care about something, you need to understand it. And I think that's where the basic problem starts. So I think, in my experience, and maybe this is a bit stereotypical, but the traditional view in government of manufacturing is not so well in tune with what manufacturing currently is in the UK, which is very high tech, very dependent on high skills, technology, etc. But as in terms of basic manufacturing processes, and certainly if you take the average backbencher, the Conservative Party and perhaps in the Labour Party as well, they think about manufacturing in rather old-fashioned terms. Now, there's some individuals who, do understand better. I really found it very insightful during my time when I was at the CBI, where I was economics director, in the late 80s and early 90s, going around visiting manufacturing businesses and realize that stereotypical view was not appropriate, and did the same when I was on the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee. I think the problem that the government faces is that when it comes down to numbers, I think 8% of employment is in manufacturing. And so in most MPs' constituencies, the bulk of employment is outside of manufacturing. And therefore they find it difficult to focus on the issues that are relevant to manufacturing. I mean, I think this came out in the Brexit debate, where I know there were some prominent manufacturers who were in support of Brexit, but I'm not sure that really the pro-Brexit bulk of the Conservative Party really understood, potential consequences of Brexit for the manufacturing economy. So I think there's a real education exercise to be done, and maybe groups like yours, and unfortunately the CBI is a very diverse group. So if you're looking for, to promote understanding of manufacturing, you probably need to look at groups that are more focused on manufacturers rather than a more diverse business group like the CBI. I don't think it's intentional. I think it's just a lack of understanding, basically.
Andrew, I wonder if I can answer. I sent you. Sorry, I've got a noisy aeroplane outside. I sent you, and at the risk of exposing myself to having made economic arguments in that document, I think I told everybody I shared the BHAG with Andrew, and it was really that point. If you like, Oscar Wilde summed it up when he said the definition of a cynic is somebody who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing, and whether that view that economists are alleged by some, including me, to have taken over the years, that it's not the value of what you do, it's just the price the transactional contribution you make to GDP. Is that a fair argument?
No, I don't think it's a fair argument for economists. I mean, there may be something.
Sorry, for politicians. For politicians.
Oh, politicians. Okay. Well, we've seen what a hash they've made of things recently. So they are a pretty of a motley crew. I think one of the disappointing things is the current generations of politicians on both sides of the house actually are not listening enough to economists at the moment. It's difficult to identify anybody who's a really prominent economic advisor both to the government or to the Labour Party. I'm willing to be contradicted on that. So, yeah, politicians are, they are, I think politics has just become much more driven by the media and by the tide of events, and is much less driven by ideas and principles. And ideas and principles are where economists come into play. And if you look at some of the ideas and principles that have informed thinking in the UK economy over the years, in the 60s in particular, it was a sort of vision of expansion and investment, which ran its course for a while. And then we hit the inflationary tides of the 70s, and then we had to impose some discipline in the economy. And then perhaps the thing that is not properly recognised is that from the 90s onwards, both under John Major and Tony Blair, the UK economy did rather well riding the tide of globalisation and making the most of the expansion of global markets. And that continued until the financial crisis, when things were then disrupted again.
If I wonder if there's an argument that does not get across to politicians about what manufacturers regard as a kind of force multiplier. I'm going to share the screen again. This was from the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders, the SMMT, yesterday.
Very distinguished.
The day before, saying full throttle needed for UK automotive success. You can see the animation there. Give you a second or two to see that. And then there's this rather good infographic here. And I think this is an argument that manufacturers would make. And I want some members, please, of the gang to chip in on this. It's the force multiplier of jobs in manufacturing, the ripple effect that, I mean, this obviously refers to automotive, but I would argue it's across the board. And this is not understood. And that the point I was trying to make in that paper was that, you know, one of these jobs, creating 1.7 further jobs, actually is regarded by current and recent past few decades political thinking as being no different from somebody perhaps in the service sector earning the same wage, but they're not comparable. That job is infinitely more important because it creates these further jobs down the line, and that's the difference between manufacturing and many other parts of the economy. It does have that knock-on effect. Is that again a reasonable suggestion to say that this is not widely accepted or understood?
Well, I think if you go into the Treasury, they will say, well, if every job in any sector in the economy creates 1.7 jobs, I've got 170% of the jobs in the economy. And they're skeptical about those arguments. And I just have to put that on the table and say, there may be sectors where that's relevant, and in particularly their instances where that's relevant. But I think where manufacturing really performs above its sort of weight in the normal measures is in terms of the fact that it could generate exports and it generates tradable activity. So we're not, most of manufacturers, I think, export to some degree. And when they export, that means we can buy imports, and we need those imports because we can't produce everything we want for ourselves, particularly things like food and so on, which we know people are worrying about in the Brexit debate. And there are parts of the services sector that do the same thing, but in general, the services sector doesn't export as much as manufacturing. So I think that's a very powerful argument for saying we need to make sure we're safeguarding and encouraging our manufacturing base. I think the other areas where manufacturing sort of punches above its weight is in terms of skills, deployment of technology, which creates spin-offs. So I find those sort of jobs figures a little bit simplistic. I think you have to think about the broader picture in terms of the way in which the manufacturing base nurtures technology, the way it nurtures skills. And that's probably more important, in my view, than these sort of jobs multipliers.
I think it's a fair point. This is the SMMT's own. I think they're feeling very, very vulnerable in the automotive sector because
they are a very good organisation. Yeah.
Okay.
I'm not trying to knock what they do, and they do. I know why they're doing it, because I think it makes a point very powerfully. But in terms of the economics of it, so to speak, I think it's the extra value added that you get from the manufacturing sector through skills, technology, exports, that is perhaps more important than those jobs multipliers, because you can create those figures for any sector in the economy, I'm afraid.
Okay, Steve Murphy.
Yeah, I'm not totally convinced by what you're saying there, Andrew. But I saw a very, very thorough report from the University of Oxford that didn't quite look on as jobs multipliers, but looked on as if manufacturing adds 1% of GDP to a 1%, then as a direct result of technical services to manufacturing, in other words, things that are there because it's manufacturing, that'll add another 1.5%, and things that are there because manufacturing is a business, like cream cakes, celebration champagne, all that stuff, adds about another percent. So the University of Oxford's report says that 1% in manufacturing ends up adding somewhere in the region of 2.5%, which is not the same as you, but it did seem, whereas as I understand it, a lot of services don't have that sort of multiplier to them. They maybe have a percent or something like that because everybody needs tins of tomatoes and stuff. So I think your argument with respect to skills, to my mind, that's more of an investment for the future. In other words, by investing in those you skills, you create an environment where manufacturing will continue to deliver, not just today, but tomorrow and in the long-term future. So it's more a way of sustaining the economy than actually bringing in money now. So do you have any comments on the Oxford report? Is it one that you?
Well, I haven't seen the report that you're referring to, but
okay.
They're these. It depends on who's produced the report. A lot of these reports are produced by a sector for their benefit to try and persuade somebody about something. And I used to work in the aviation industry, and we came up with very similar types of figures. And that's a service sector activity, aviation, in terms of airlines and travel, etc. So I just think to persuade, I suppose my point is, if you're trying to persuade the government and you're trying to persuade civil servants who are bombarded with these arguments from all sorts of sectors, you need to make a more sort of distinctive argument about the distinctive contribution of manufacturing. Well, I think there are some very good arguments to make, as I say, about the technology, the science-based skills, exports, and you can make the arguments about the supply. I mean, essentially what you're making is a supply chain type argument. Though, Treasury civil servants and people in the biz department know that these supply chains go all the way across Europe. And so the supply chains that feed UK manufacturing, go to all sorts of places like Germany, the Czech Republic, the Netherlands, all sorts of countries around the world, China, for example. So I think the argument for manufacturing, in my view, needs to be made on a slightly more sort of sophisticated level rather than just, well, we generate more jobs than anyone else, because the number of jobs that are directly generated is quite small, and then the supply chain impacts are not necessarily different from other activities.
Oh, thank you.
It's interesting. I've often wondered. I mean, I used to cover Westminster as a journalist, and I covered Brussels, I covered Washington, and all that. And I know politicians, whenever a special interest group is trying to talk to them, their eyes kind of glaze over, because they hear what they call special pleading, and it annoys the heck out of me when I hear that phrase. Oh, they're just asking for more cash, Now, of course, we do understand that a lot of people are asking for more cash or support or whatever. But I wonder whether there is a bit of a particular hangover when it comes to manufacturing because of what happened in the 70s and 80s with deindustrialization on the sort of large inefficient industries, and nobody really noticing that the that there was a regeneration taking place away from the high street and away from city centres. And that old thing about picking winners, that horrible phrase again, you still hear that phrase. And it's so annoying because it's an excuse to shut down conversation. And there's nothing worse than having a conversation with a politician who seems to make up their mind and walk away. So I'm just wondering if any of that resonates with you.
It does. It certainly does. I started my career as an economist at the CBI in the mid-1980s. So it was in the immediate aftermath of that period you're talking about. And that was definitely the view of the Thatcher government about manufacturing. It's failed us. We need to focus on the financial services sector and other service sectors. I think the debate has moved on a bit from then, but when I look at the front benches of both political parties, I can't see anybody, even Kwasi Kwarteng, who is a guy I've got a lot of respect for. He's the business minister. He's quite a thoughtful bloke, but he's not got any grounding in, I don't think he's traipsed around the country visiting the sort of medium-sized manufacturing plants which really underpin the current manufacturing base in the UK. And of course, now he's a minister, he hasn't got time to do it either. So it's a catch-22. Unless these guys have got some previous experience that gives them the knowledge about modern manufacturing, they find it very difficult to get it in office.
I found it quite remarkable that I think it was in the Parliament up until the 2017. No, it was up until the 2019 election. There was only one MP in the House of Parliament who was an engineer.
It doesn't surprise me.
Member, Chayon Wura, the only engineer in the entire, any experience whatsoever, any understanding of what happens in the sector. So as you probably gathered, that we do have something of a mission to try and raise profile and in ways that we're probably best suited to, which is media. But we've got a terrific support network growing up, as you can see around us. Has anybody else got some more questions for Andrew? I should point out that he's possibly got to leave us in 10 minutes or so because there's another arrangement that he's got to, another appointment he's got to get to. So let's make the most of the next 10 minutes while we've got him. I'm going to put people on the spot if you don't put your hands up.
We can shift the focus away from inflation manufacturing to the sort of global economy, for example.
Well, pandemic. I mean, I think one of the most interesting and least debated things is the shock to the supply chains and will the world ever be the same again, Andrew?
Well, there's always a tendency to say the world won't be the same again, but lots of the aspects of the world are the same as they were before. But sometimes we didn't appreciate the way the world was changing until we get a big shock. It's a bit like the financial crisis. We suddenly realized that there were things happening before the financial crisis we should have been much more aware of. The sort of new normal that people talk about after the pandemic is a mixture of things that were bubbling under already, like the shift in the world economy towards Asia, the use of new technology, get things going online, the recognition of climate change, changing patterns of work, such as more people working from home. All those things were happening to some degree before the pandemic, but they've suddenly sort of been accelerated or brought into sharper focus by the pandemic. And that's the nature of economic trends, that these trends are moving under the surface, and then you get a big shock that suddenly brings them into focus. I mean, just to go back about 100 years, there were some terrible times about 100 years ago after the First World War, when we had a pandemic and we had, 3 very bad years, much worse than we've experienced recently. Unemployment shot up to about 10%. Yet in the decade and a half that follows, in the second half of the 1920s and the 1930s, we actually had things coming along like radio, motor cars, new technologies, which actually shaped the way things were after the war. I think people at the time didn't think they were so momentous, but after the Second World War, suddenly we woke up and we thought we've got all these technologies, and we had the wartime experience which boosted those technologies. So I'm not quite sure where this is leading, but I suppose my point is that yes, there is to some extent a new normal, but it's a lot of the ingredients of it are things that we were living with before, and they've just been accelerated or they've been put into sharper focus.
Stephen, you've got your hand raised.
And my mute button on. Just to pick your brains, Andrew, with COP26 coming up, I wonder what you think of the economics of sustainability, particularly in manufacturing, but sustainability generally. Does it make economic sense, or is it just something we've got to do?
Sort of both, really. It's something that we've got to do, but actually it can be done in a very cost-efficient way for many businesses if we have the right sort of framework of regulations, etc. So I don't think it's something that businesses should fear. But as with all things, it needs to be properly planned for. There needs to be the proper policy environment so that if businesses do the right things, they're not penalized. They actually see benefits from it. But I don't subscribe to the view that having a more sustainable economy, if it's done in the right way, is bad for economic growth. I think it's either neutral or could be positive. If you look at where we are now and we're looking for sources of investment to support the economy coming out of the pandemic, actually green investments of various sorts, could be really quite helpful, but not just for their own sake, somehow everything that green is good, but reinforcing sensible behaviours within business, so they put themselves on a more sustainable footing. And that's not a 1 or 2 year issue; it's a 5 to 10 year issue, in my view.
Just on that, I mean, how important would you see government intervention being in terms of taxes and incentives?
Well, I think it's potentially very important, but governments are very timid on this front. For example, you don't need to just look at recent history, but when we went back in the early 90s, when Norman Lamont was Chancellor, and remember him, he's still going, and he announced his budget, which imposed VAT on domestic energy at the normal VAT rate. And there was such an outcry that it ultimately forced his resignation. Ken Clarke took over, and then he said, well, let's have a reduced rate of VAT. And that's basically where we are now. I think the main problems for the politicians in trying to design tax and spending initiatives in this area is the politics of it. If there's anything that causes people any sort of economic pain somewhere in the economy, it creates a massive backlash. And what's lacking, in my view, and what reinforces that reaction, is the lack of a strategy. So if you've got a long-term strategy, which is consistently followed over not just a year or two, but as I say, 5 to 10 years, you might get acceptance, but it has to be well designed has to be designed in consultation with business, has to be designed in consultation with experts. And we don't get that from politics these days, I'm afraid. You know, we get knee-jerk reactions as, you know, the Chancellor opens his red box and out flies the latest green initiative. And it's often difficult to work out whether it's a replica of what happened before. In other words, it's nothing new, or whether it's something genuinely new or it replaces what's gone before. And the politics of trying to design the right policies is probably more challenging than the economics. You can get an economist like myself who would hopefully could advise the government very sensibly on these issues, but it's not always politically acceptable.
I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat box. John Hardwick, you made an excellent point. I'm very happy to pick it up if you want to talk about it. It's just eliminating waste must be good for business and the environment. The fact is that if something like the sustainability argument, whether it's got policy behind it or not, encourages businesses to become less wasteful and less polluting and so on, and more conserving of energy, then that's just a good business argument. I mean, John, do you want to just pick up on that and expand on it?
Yeah, I can do, although I just thought it was fairly self-evident, but you know, just look at some of the industries that are managing to make circular supply chains, you know, and get the recycling going on within the supply chain. They're finding huge economic benefit from that, and it's improving their profitability. So I do think that, and actually I sense that this is now happening. You know, 10 years ago, it was seen that environmental investment was, you know, to the detriment of the business, and we couldn't afford to do it. I think with some of the innovation that people are now finding and moving towards circular supply chains, they're actually saying we can't afford not to do it. So, and I do feel that's shifted over the last 10 years, which I'm very
I fully agree with you. Yeah, I do think that's the case. And I think it's been particularly so in manufacturing industry, in the sense that, as you say, the notion of cutting down on costs, cutting down on waste can be often very much in tune with environmental objectives.
I mean, just one example from my own career. I used to work at the Horlicks factory. I was site director of the Horlicks factory, and I can't claim credit for it. It was my predecessor identified that we were sending stuff from our process that was going to landfill. They identified that it could be, some of it could be used for incineration in a clean way and generate power, and some of it could go to animal feed. So we actually started making a profit out of something that was a cost on our P&L. So it just needs a bit of creativity, I think, and collaboration as well. You know, understanding what you've got that you may think is rubbish that somebody else actually thinks has value.
Yeah. And I think also the area of collaboration, which is really important, which I think maybe is coming back a little bit, but the notion of government collaborating with business. I think there were times, particularly in the 1980s, where business and government seemed at loggerheads on many issues. Indeed, the Director General of the CBI in the early 80s, Terry Beckett, very distinguished manufacturer, talked about having a bare knuckle fight with government, which sent him into purdah for about 2 years with the Thatcher administration. I think you know, these sensible initiatives can't be developed properly without some degree of collaboration between government and business. And
sorry, I just want to share this again. Share something that this is on the BBC today. It's just
yeah, I saw this actually. I thought that's quite interesting.
Yeah. This right to repair, and manufacturers now legally required to make spare parts available. The whole aim is to try to stop the obvious, you know, buy it cheap, built-in obsolescence.
Chuck it away and then buy another one. Yeah.
Yeah. And that is a very interesting. Also, they put it under the climate change category. Such an interesting development. I didn't actually see that coming, and I just thought that is a government rule coming in, the right to repair rules. So that is policy beginning to shift manufacturing behavior to accommodate consumer demand. Did anybody else see that one coming? Is anybody else doing anything that might be impacted by that? Yeah, Steve.
I think I had sort of multiple concerns about this. Although I think it's going in the right direction, what it doesn't say is that products should be designed so they can be repaired.
Yeah.
And that's a totally different concept, because on the BBC website, a lot of what people complained about was that for the sake of a 5p part, you needed a 25 quid sub-assembly and even more. So I think it's going in the right direction, but I think it's only just starting to get at what really needs to be done, and that products need to be designed in such a way that they can be repaired, and we need to buy less of them and throw less out. And something came up again, which I didn't know until about a year ago. There is actually a great British manufacturer of washing machines called EBAC, who build very, very reliable machines. And yet everybody buys German if they're going for quality. They go for Bosch. So I think it's another area where, you know, the Britain has got an absolutely top class supplier, but they're just not well known. I just find it totally crazy.
Yeah.
Should speak to our friends in marketing and advertising, because that is what those two disciplines are precisely there to achieve.
Nick, I'm going to have to sort of depart.
Okay, Andrew. Yeah.
Go to another place. But is there a final question you want to pose?
I
somebody wants to pose.
Please, somebody else got a last minute thought for Andrew. Please speak now. Said he's going to another place. It sounded like the House of Lords. That's what.
No, it's actually I'm responsible for church music, and we're trying to get ourselves positioned for our choir starting up. It sounds very mundane, but we need to be there by 7 o'clock, so I have to get
Stephen.
on there.
Yeah, a very quick one. Matthew Lynn, writing in the Telegraph on Monday, he was talking about the number of migrants in the EU, which could be anything to about 7 million. Anyway, the upshot was, he was saying, well, of course, we need to sort of replace these, and was advocating the use of autonomous intelligence to try and replace these jobs. I just wonder any quick view on that, because quite clearly that could have a pretty destructive impact in terms of employment patterns.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think that 5 million people are registered to be part of the government scheme. So I don't know whether there were 7 million to start with or whatever, but hopefully we will still be an attractive place for people to come and be able to work here. I think it's a bit of a myth that artificial intelligence or other forms of technology displace jobs. They do displace jobs in some sectors, but then they create jobs in other sectors. And I think it's important in the public debate that second part of that equation gets recognised. Because after all, the Luddites in the early 19th century went around smashing up machines because they thought it was destroying their livelihoods. And yet the 19th century saw this massive explosion of manufacturing and technology, and then that was continued in the 20th century. So I think it's a big myth that we should fear technology displacing jobs. I think actually it does create jobs as well. And actually, to some extent, I mean, we shouldn't see immigration as a solution to problems that we can actually fix ourselves in this country. So yes, we shouldn't be over restrictive in terms of immigration. I fully agree with that.
Yep.
But we actually have quite a free we have had quite a free immigration policy, and hopefully we will still be fairly accessible to people coming.
Yeah, just to add that.
Sorry, can I just make the final point? Would you agree that that the immigration high watermark that was allowed an awful lot of companies to be competitive that now may not be competitive, and there may be quite a fallout in the particularly in the hospitality sector?
Yeah, that might be true in terms of hospitality. My minder is just coming in to remind me that we need to go somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's less of an issue for manufacturers, though. There may be some sectors like food processing where that's a bit of an issue. But I think the question about immigration is get the balance right. We shouldn't just be trying to make our economy based on the cheapest possible immigrant labour. That's not a good thing. On the other hand, we shouldn't become over restrictive, so we've got to get the balance right.
Yeah, that's precisely the point that Matthew Lynn was making.
Thank you very much indeed.
I'm sorry, I've got to go. The church choir beckons, but very nice to chat to you guys, and perhaps I can come back in a few months' time, and we can have another chat.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay, Nick and everybody, good to chat to you guys.
Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thanks, Andrew.
Bye. Having trouble. It's gone. Okay. Well, thoughts? Anybody? Who's got some thoughts on what Andrew had to say? Agree? Disagree? Yeah, John.
The question I wanted to ask him there at the end, actually, I mean, clearly he's a pro-manufacturing economist, and he gave us some good steer about how to make our case. I just wondered if he had any killer statistics that he thinks we should be, or killer messages. He was making the point about our positive impact on the balance of trade, but I wanted to know if there were any other key things that he felt we ought to be leveraging.
I think I did hear him say that. I've actually wrote it down. I think he said you've got a very distinctive message to impart based on the technology, the science, and obviously the R&D element of it all, the skills you impart, and exports, rather than that sort of. I mean, again, he's quite a sort of old hand at this, and he's heard it a million times. People say, well, you know what, every one of our jobs creates another 1.7 jobs, and I think he's quite jaded around messaging like that. But I think he makes a good point about the way that actually manufacturing can be, and engineering. I keep needing to throw engineering in because not all engineers manufacture, but our manufacturing and engineering sectors have got trailblazing qualities about them that can make an enormous difference to our future if they are given the chance. And of course, the hugest problem of all is that this sort of rather hands-off, quite laissez-faire government, despite what they say, we're up against countries whose manufacturers and engineers are getting masses of support from their governments, and there's that hugest risk of all that we just get left in the dust again, and that's what's obviously exercising all our minds. Yeah, that makes sense, John, in terms of messaging. I mean, I'm not, or statistics. I think it's.
Yeah, I suppose it was something more tangible, or some examples. Did he have examples that he could bring to mind of, this is what manufacturing has done for the economy or even society, that that is something we could hang our hat on. It was all a bit theoretical, I suppose. What are the practical examples that we could shout about? it just got me thinking along that. Wasn't critical. It was just making me think that that's.
No, sure. And you know, that is very much worth us collectively thinking about. I mean, are there, can we come up with some of those practical examples you mentioned of I mean, we could always think of the negatives, such as, you know, if a major factory closes down in the town, it doesn't take out just the 500 jobs there, it knocks out all the other jobs around it. And that's why when he was a bit dismissive of that 1.7 extra jobs, you know, I felt like saying to him, well, just watch what happens when a town that depends on a factory loses that factory. It's not the 500 jobs in the factory go, there's probably another 600-700 go with it. Anything from the cleaners through to the sandwich seller. But I mean, those are negatives. It's I think there still is virtue in the force multiplier argument, despite what he says. But maybe it is just an argument that jaded politicians and economists like him have heard too many times, and that is part of the problem, getting cut through. And that is what we're trying to do with the BHAG, is to find ways of getting the cut through. And I still think at the moment the book and the documentary are good ways to try and do that. The book in particular, of which more, I think probably within the next week or two, we can talk about some progress on that. Anybody got any last minute thoughts? We're approaching the witching hour at a rapid rate of knots. Anybody? Yeah, it's Michael.
Yeah, just on the positive side, I just made the point there, you know, we're looking at a mega factory in Sunderland creating thousands of jobs, £1 billion investment. Kwasi Kwarteng was on the radio this morning, failing to disclose how much contribution the government had made. They had made enough contribution to get that kind of investment. So stuff is happening on the positive side.
It was announced that it was 100 million on the news tonight.
Okay. Now, we were criticized. He was criticized also at some point because government is putting money into this thing. It's government doing investing in the private sector. So you can't win, can you?
They're picking winners.
They're picking winners, yeah. We know what you're doing.
They need to do something pretty quickly, don't they, about getting skills, the right kind of skills, into Sunderland area. And not just government, Nissan also, of course, but that's a huge challenge, isn't it?
Well, that's interesting. I'll drop a note to Ian Green. Ian runs the skills department at Nissan. He's a good chum. I haven't spoken to him for ages. That's a good reminder to get back in touch and ask him what they're doing. Steve Murphy, we need the approach of terrorists to get manufacturing on the government agenda. Please, I do hope this chat doesn't get out to the to Her Majesty's Police Department, because quite honestly, seriously, bomb chucking, aging manufacturers chucking bombs into Parliament, I'm sure, is not quite the right way to go. Anyway,
I think you better edit that out before this goes on YouTube.
Yeah,
well, do you? Do you? Because if we could get the same publicity for what we're trying to do here as some clerk who tried to hijack a council meeting, then you know, it would be pretty powerful.
Yeah. How you doing?
Just for the record, Her Majesty's Police Force, I'm not going to be chucking bombs at Parliament anytime soon. in case that was in any doubt. Yeah.
But when I was a lad, my dad used to point out that the Israeli government were mainly composed of people that were trying to blow him up when he was doing his national service. One thing I would say about terrorists, and even look at ISIS, their communications game is amazing, because they can get people on the basis of their communications game. They can get people to do horrific things because they are effective communicators. Now, okay, I know it's a bit left field, but my point is, look at the communications methods. We can't get people out of bed to do a day's work, and they can get people to create terrible acts. There's something they know about people, and they know about communications that we don't know.
It's the threat of death. You don't do it, really.
On that
Nick.
On that bombshell.
Let's bombshell. Thank you very much indeed, Steve. Very good one. Okay,